across the early Bronze Age landscape. Now, here we have, for those of you that aren't familiar with Egypt and the Levant, this is a map of Egypt and the Levant. It's about 450 kilometers from Egypt into the southern Levant. When we look at the geological map of Egypt, we can see that it's mostly quaternary with recent Nile alluvium along the Nile Valley. And then in the blue areas to the right and left of the Nile Valley, we have tertiary Eocene, which are pretty young and have strontium values around 0.7070. Now, for the Levant, on the other hand, we have some older material, specifically in the southern Levant, which consists mostly of older geological formations, which contain higher strontium values. The area, particularly around Tel Megiddo, consists of lower basalt, Mauritia Formation, and Adulam Formation, all of which are very different from what we have in the Nile Valley. So that gives you brief understanding of where we're talking about geographically. In terms of the chronology of this project, we're looking at the Chalcolithic right until the EB4. So we're talking anywhere from around 3700 BCE all the way to 2000 BCE, right from the Egyptian Chalcolithic through to the Old Kingdom. And there, right below, you have some of the main kings and pharaohs that ruled during this time. So with that being said, let's get right into why this project kind of came to be. First, we have evidence of interregional exchange between Egypt and the Levant. This, of course, takes in the form of pottery. We have an Egyptian relief carved fragment from Bet Yera. We have the jewelry, as you see here on the side, that's inlaid with carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli, objects and materials that basically aren't found here in Egypt. And in the far left-hand corner, we have a table from EB1 sites that contain mollusks from the Nile Valley that were also found in the southern Levant. So if we have all this interregional exchange, the main question is, what about animals, and were animals exchanged? So the evidence that we do currently have for cattle exchange are some of the main records that we have derived mostly from Egypt. And one of the main records is the annual economic state of Egypt recorded on the royal annals. And here we have the Palermo stone during the reign of Senefru, which records 200,000 livestock from Nubia and 13,100 cattle from Libya being brought into Egypt. And the annals really highlight the importance of cattle as war booty in the missionary work conducted by the state. Another piece of evidence that we have is the siege scene from the 5th dynasty tomb of Khasi Khemwet at Saqqara, which depicts the invasion of a foreign walled town. And it's been suggested that this scene really illustrates a mission outside of Egypt, and that the walled town is likely an EB settlement located in the southern Levant. What is most interesting, as I'll show you in a second, is that the cattle are being seen taken from inside the city walls. Another piece of evidence that we have derives from the reign of Khufu, from the Valley Temple of Khufu in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, that illustrates a procession of Khufu's cattle. And the hieroglyphics here really illustrates the various lands and titles connected with cattle in foreign territories being brought into Egypt from these foreign lands. And here we just have a little bit of a closer version of it. So when you look at the depiction, the drawing on the top right-hand corner, you can see the cattle there being herded away from the city walls so that they're not captured. So if we have all this cattle exchange being brought in, the question remains, how are they being transported? And basically, we have two main routes that connected Egypt and the southern Levant. We have the land and sea routes, which are well known, the Ways of Horus and the Byblos run. As you see here, trade exchange and interconnectivity was made possible through both the terrestrial and marine routes that are well known. The dashed route, as you see there along the coastline, is the Byblos run, the sea route that connected Egypt all the way up to Byblos, to the northern Levant. And in the shaded area there, you have the conquered or the established Egyptian territories that is connected through the Ways of Horus, which is the land route connecting right through the Sinai into the other regions of the southern Levant. Now, along with this, we also have tomb scenes from Egypt dating from the pre-dynastic right through the Old Kingdom that shows cattle to be taken on boats, as you see here on the left side. Now, most of these vessels were likely used to carry and transport cattle throughout the Nile Valley, but they weren't necessarily carried in long distances. But we do have larger vessels that were capable of doing so. But this does illustrate, nonetheless, the fact that animals were being transported throughout the Nile and in areas outside of the Nile Valley. We also, lastly, have zooarchaeological evidence for cattle. So when we look at, I created this table based on the zooarchaeological evidence that we have from EB sites, early Bronze Age 1 to 3. And in the red highlighted areas, we have, in the zooarchaeological record, more than 20, up to 60% of the cattle, of the assemblage, zooarchaeological assemblage, are cattle remains. So, for example, in Tur Iqbena, we have 60% of cattle remains for the EB1 period. And you can see, in fact, right along the coastline where the Ways of Horus and the Egyptian settlements were, for the most part, that there's this relationship. There's this relationship between sites that have Egyptian contact and high quantities of cattle. So the question is, were there cattle exchange that existed between those two areas? Now, in order to examine this, I did a multi-site study, mostly focusing on two areas. We have the site of Tel Megiddo and Kom el Hisson. First, I'll talk about the site of Tel Megiddo in the southern Levant. Now, one of the major sites that had Egyptian connections is Tel Megiddo, and the site is in the Jezreel Valley of Israel, and has been the most type site of the early Bronze Age Levant since the excavations of the University of Chicago in the 20s and 30s. It's in the northern part of Israel and strategically located at the crossing of trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia. And it also stood along the northwest-southeast route that connected Phoenician cities with Jerusalem. Therefore, Tel Megiddo is mostly known for its transient trading settlement, but it's also known for its great temple. Now, the two main areas of Tel Megiddo where my samples do come from are the Tel Megiddo Temple, the Egyptian temple, and we also have the recently excavated site of Tel Megiddo East, which is the adjacent site of Tel Megiddo. In 2010, the Jezreel Valley Regional Project, the JVRP, conducted investigations at the adjacent site of Tel Megiddo East, which had architectural elements and a lot of cattle. And I'm talking about a lot of cattle in comparison to other EB sites in the region for the same period. And recent excavations have revealed that the high quantities of cattle are worth studying, especially considering there were Egyptian influence at that site as well, at Tel Megiddo East. The next area we're going to have just a quick look at before I get into the data is the Kom el Hisson in the Egyptian Nile Delta settlement. I was graciously provided the assemblage from Dr. Richard Redding for this isotopic project. And the Kom el Hisson site is on the eastern side of the Nile Delta, indicated by the red dot on the map there. And it's an Old Kingdom site that also has some Middle Kingdom elements. Its location in the third nome of Egypt is also known as the Estate of Cattle. And its focus, main religious focus, is the goddess Hathor, as well as the faunal and textual records there really indicate that it was a cattle rearing site or cattle transit site. So not a lot of cattle found at the site, but the evidence that we do have suggests that it was very important in the economic state of cattle in Egypt. Now, the next area that I do want to talk about is, of course, the isotopic analysis conducted at the site. So we conducted I conducted two stages of analysis, isotopic analysis. First stage was the tooth enamel carbonate, the incremental tooth enamel carbonate for the carbon and the oxygen values of the individuals, along with the strontium values of the individuals, to look at not just paleo diet, but look at mobility and animal herding management practices. The second stage was, of course, bulk collagen, where we have carbon and nitrogen, and all of the analysis were done at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, graciously supported by Dr. Stanley Ambrose. And what do we have for data? Well, according to the data, although this is very preliminary, I have come so far to three very general conclusions. First thing I can say is that we see two distinct birth seasons, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second thing we can talk about is the paleo diet. Thirdly, we do see some animal mobility in the data set. First thing, when we look at the birth season synchronisms, we can see that the oxygen isotopes do range from negative 534 to positive 5.56. So we're talking about a fairly large gap in the oxygen isotopes here, suggesting a very wide range of values across the samples. TME9, sample number 9, has the lowest oxygen values that we see in the data set. Now, the oxygen data currently demonstrates that we have two birth seasons. We have a very strong correlation in the 20 to 30 millimeter enamel root junction with negative 18O. Apologies for that. I wasn't able to get the proper annotation on there, but the negative 18O at 20 to 30 millimeters. And we also see a few individuals with the opposite enriched values 18O at 20 to 30 millimeters. So what this is telling me is that we definitely have two different birth seasons in which they were born in. Which season we can't necessarily say, but with the negative 18O values, these correlate strongly with the wet seasons. So it is likely that these individuals in the yellow were born in the dry season. Another conclusion that we can draw is, of course, the paleo diet. Now, the isotopes, carbon isotopes, range from negative 11.10 to positive 0.30. These individuals demonstrate that we have a very strong mixed diet. Most were C3 browsers. In fact, 4 individuals. 2 individuals seem to be mixed feeders, and 1 we have potentially a more strongly leaning C4 consumer. And this you can see, of course, in the collagen data that you see just below here in the table. Unfortunately, I can't zoom into that at this time. Lastly, we have the animal mobility that we can see. And according to the strontium values, we have 3 current patterns of strontium values. We have those that are 0.7059 to 70780. We have a second pattern in the blue, 70800 to 70825. And lastly, in the yellow, we have 70830 to 70850. Now, these indicate that these individuals, the local range that were established was 70800 to 70810. So none of these individuals are really matching the local range of this local strontium that was established through the pig remains. So this is essentially telling me that what we're seeing at Tel Megiddo and with the samples coming from Komal Hisson, that what we have is an open market exchange. These cattle are coming from throughout the area of the Levant, and furthermore, in the area of 707, 708, the lower strontium values, what we're seeing is really areas outside of the area of Israel. So TME 8, 13, 18, and 40, these 3 individuals are certainly non-local and possibly from Egypt, because they do seem to match the strontium values. If I just go back here on the left-hand corner, we have the published strontium values from Michel Bouzon and the team that indicate that these individuals are certainly probably from the Nile Valley. And when we look at the carbon and the oxygen of these individuals, these also strongly correlate with values outside of the individuals from Tel Megiddo East, as you can see here in these individuals. This, you can see the data a little bit more clearly. TME 40, I do want to stress as well that TME 40 did derive from the Egyptian temple and was found in contexts that had Egyptian material. And TME 30 as well, that I'm suggesting comes from Egypt, also has derived from an area of Tel Megiddo East that had the only area that had Egyptian material found at the site. So therefore, I will wrap up with the conclusions. I know we're running out of time. So in a nutshell, the isotope analysis really suggests that we see a lot of variability in the cattle at Tel Megiddo. We do see 2 seasons of birth from these individuals. We see more of a C3 diet. We see some mixed and very little C4 consumers. And these animals are also moving throughout the landscape in various seasons of consumption. And what we see is really an open market exchange at Tel Megiddo. We see that these cattle are coming from areas throughout perhaps Israel and also connected to Egypt, suggesting that there's interregional animal exchange with Egypt during the early Bronze Age. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your time and for your attention. And if you're interested in more, you can scan this link below and follow my academia page for updates on future projects. Thank you very much.
So you had a relatively limited range in strontium values, and you mentioned that you'd used pigs for the local range or to identify local at one site. How well do we understand the strontium biosphere in this region? How confident are you of our knowledge of the variation?
I'm still analyzing. Yeah, I got that. I'm still analyzing the data. So far, it's been a threefold understanding. It's not necessarily just the strontium values that I'm really looking at here. It's the fact that it was also found archaeologically with with Egyptian objects and Egyptian artifacts. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of the strontium value, there was obviously a number of publications that have been published on the strontium values throughout the Levant. And so far, from what I've seen on the published material, we do not have any 707, 7077, 7076 values for the Levant at this time. There is another project on the go by Gideon Hartman, Elizabeth Arnold, and Haskell Greenfield, and they are currently working on an isoscape with modern plant remains, and that will include the area of Tel Megiddo. So that data is forthcoming. But currently, right now, with the data that we do have, I can say pretty concretely that we don't have any of the values, at least surrounding the area of Tel Megiddo, with those values.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Thank you. I'm going to take up the pig thing again. Is there any textual evidence about pig husbandry? Because one of the things that I think might be interesting to think about is whether if people are importing vegetable foodstuffs, particularly grains, whether that would wend its way into the pig's food, and then you would not necessarily be getting a kind of local strontium signature, but what you'd actually be getting is maybe an averaged kind of signature of what was coming into this site. So I don't know if you have any textual things that would tell you what they're doing with the pigs during this period.
Yes, I'm currently investigating that. The pigs are complicated, and I understand that we can use them as a local, to establish more of a local provenance. However, the concern is, what if the pig is eating non-local foods, or if non-local grains are brought in? And in fact, we do see grains being brought in from Egypt, and a lot of foodstuffs being traded and exchanged. So this question of were cattle eating foreign grain is something I'm still investigating, and I think it's a very good thing to highlight. I don't have an answer for you at this time, but it is something that I'm still investigating.
Right, quick one on the chat. So this is from Nina Kovalik. Thank you for an interesting presentation. Do you see changes of cattle pastures in specific seasons?
Yes, we do. I do see that. I haven't been able to identify specifically in the wet and dry season if they are not grazing or eating plants in particular areas at each season. It's quite variable, but you do see, for instance, in TME5, which I can just share real quickly here. I know we don't have very much time, but in TME5, we do see that the individual is consuming in one region. In the top left-hand corner, you have TME5 in one region during the dry season, and in a very different region during the wet season. So in some individuals, you do see it, but you don't see that throughout all individuals at all, for all seasons.
Great, thanks very much. Let's thank
you.